welcome everyone to our third and final installment of this little Insights webinar series we have been running over the last few months. Insights being graciously powered by Brandwatch, one of our best partners at Uno Technologies. And we're very excited to talk to you guys about Black Friday and share some insights around Black Friday today. And with that, I'd like to kick off with breaking news just in. Sources have told us that Black Friday is approaching very quickly, but are consumers actually spending? Let's cross over to our man in the field, David, for the latest update on this developing story. What can you tell us, David?
Great questions there, Sean. In fact, inflation's through the roof. All our holiday money is going to tires burst by potholes, and the cost of eggs is nearing the cost of petrol. That begs the question, do we need Black Friday now more than ever?
And that's indeed the answer we're going to try and unpack today. Black Friday is upon us, and it's going to be a spicy one. But before we really kick into the meat and potatoes of this webinar, let's just talk about what's coming up on the agenda. We're basically splitting this webinar in half. It will be a shorter one as well because we're only really covering one topic, but the sort of way we've structured it is, firstly, we're going to look back at Black Friday, not just 2022, but going even further back and looking at some trends over time. But then, indeed, we will be focusing and zooming in a little bit on 2022, what happened last year, top brands, who were the what were the top trends and the sentiment surrounding Black Friday. And then moving on to the second part, where David will take us through sort of looking ahead, what we can expect coming up for this Black Friday, and looking ahead even further than that, some consumer sentiment, who's the most vocal brands, and do we actually even find value in Black Friday, which I think is this is the question. But with that being said, who the hell am I? Some of you might ask. Well, my name is Sean. I'm the product lead for Brandwatch at Uno Technologies. I've spent over 8 years in the social media industry, both in-house and at agency, and right now I'm living out the dream as your go-to Brandwatch guy in Africa. David?
Thanks, Sean. My name is David Fowler. I am the Senior Data and Reporting Analyst at Uno Tech. I've been in the MarTech and specifically on the analytics side of things for about 4 years, and I'm very excited to share some hopefully valuable insights with you today. If this is your first Uno webinar with the Data Bros, let me tell you a little bit about the organization Sean and I are so proudly representing today. Uno Technologies is Africa's gateway to global leading marketing technology. We boast a tech stack of social listening, audience data, voice of customer, and consumer journey mapping tools that help our clients understand what people are saying, thinking, and doing. Here on this next slide, you can see a picture of our brilliant team of experts on the right, with Don, our COO, in front of the staircase, and 3/4 of Calvin, our CEO's face, in the bottom right corner. And in the bottom right picture, you can see us all on a little vacation out in Limpopo. We're South Africans with a finger on the pulse of the local context. We provide local tech support, we're BEE rated, and offer you access to the best in breed of global tech. Additionally, we host fun little webinars, which I'll now let Sean kick off.
Thanks, David. So kicking things off, let's take a step back and look at some of the data around Black Friday from previous years, as I mentioned. I'd like to, firstly, before we really kick it off, pose a question in the chat right off the bat. And just with a one-word answer, can you guys tell me whether you think mentions around Black Friday have actually increased or decreased year on year? Just one word, just say increase or decrease, and let's have a look. But we've got to, keep a few things in mind here, such as the global cost of living crisis that the world is currently facing, but also the rise of consumerism, that trend that is kind of increasing in our society at the same time, which is kind of contrasting, interestingly. But it's actually interesting to think about in reality where Black Friday fits into this picture. And I can see some comments in the chat. It's actually seems to be quite divided, eh? Some people saying decrease, some people saying increase, but let's have a look. Let's have a look. I forgot about that slide. Some of you guessed it. Mentions around Black Friday globally have actually decreased year on year. As you can see from the graph on the left, people have actually had other things in their minds recently. brands didn't really participate as heavily in the Black Friday conversation, and consumers weren't really as interested in chatting about it online either. Plus, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic and the global cost of living crisis, as I've already mentioned, have definitely heavily impacted the shopping experience in recent times. Now, keep in mind, this is global data. So when we look at South African data, on Twitter specifically, conversation around Black Friday has not trended down at all. In fact, it's actually stayed relatively consistent over the years. Only a slight drop in mentions during COVID times, as you can see around 2020, and then going back 2018, 2016, slightly lower mentions. But it's interesting to note that that conversation has not trended down at all in South Africa, which is quite surprising. So let's unpack that just a little bit more. So as you can see on this slide, and as we all know, there are many brands that consistently leverage Black Friday. More often than not, communications run for the entirety of the month and are often backed by a competition mechanic. In many of these cases, and without calling anyone out, this is very important, or throwing any kind of shade. I mean, these brands are amazing at what they do. But it is interesting to note that most of the examples here, and these examples are the top Black Friday posts in South Africa in 2022, based on reach and engagement. They don't actually pertain to any kind of Black Friday offer. Rather, it's a competition mechanic that leverages the Black Friday hashtag, sure. But in other words, if you actually remove the hashtag from this content or any reference to Black Friday, the context of the post would not actually change. It's just a competition. But with that being said, let's also take a look at an example of a brand that does not actually leverage Black Friday, at least not in the traditional way, and that actually offers a different perspective. David?
Thanks, Sean. Patagonia specifically takes an interesting alternative stance to Black Friday. In opposition to fast fashion, and as we all know, Patagonia to do with the environment in mind, Patagonia kind of demonizes Black Friday, urging people to buy only what they need and fix clothes rather than buying new items. You may remember these posters, "Don't buy this jacket." And the message around this poster was intended to encourage people to consider the effect of consumerism on the environment. And of course, also just to drive understanding around alternatives to fast fashion and fixing things rather than buying new ones. So if you're looking to buy a trendy Patagonia fleece jacket or a t-shirt next month, you're most likely going to have to pay full price.
Cool. And then this is probably one of my favorite things that I've ever done on Brandwatch. But looking at brand visibility during 2022, now keep in mind we're looking at 2022 here. We took to Brandwatch and we actually used the image insights and logo recognition feature to see which brands' logos were shared and mentioned the most during November. Interestingly, we can see that Adidas dominated the mention share of voice by an insane margin, with no other brand actually even coming close to competing. And just to clarify how this data came about is we didn't specify what brands to look at. We just basically put in the date range, and we asked Brandwatch to pull out the logos of the brands that were most visible during this period. So once again, Adidas really dominating the mentions in terms of logo shares in last year's November. These mentions, though, interestingly, were not actually driven by Adidas directly, but rather other brands, either distributing Adidas, like Jumia in the example on the left, as well as partnership content such as YFM and Adidas running a competition on the right-hand side here in a campaign that ran for the entirety of November, calling for people to actually share their Adidas wish lists or baskets or carts with a cash prize incentive. These two campaigns, this Jumia and the YFM campaign, actually accounted for the majority of Adidas logo mentions during Black Friday in 2022 and actually resulted in a reach of nearly 1.5 million. But this isn't quite where the story ends. So instead of filtering for mentions, what we then did was we filtered the results for reach, and we got a surprising result. So while Adidas initially dominated mentions, the reach they received was actually comparable to other brands like you could see, I know there's a lot here, but Visa and Samsung. While Xbox, as seen on the right here, actually dominated reach by an incredible margin. So just to remind you guys, I've got a side-by-side comparison here. So on the top here, you can see that Adidas reach, Adidas mentions with low Xbox reach. But on the bottom, you can see actually low Adidas reach and high Xbox reach, which is quite a crazy comparison here. What drove that Xbox reach? Again, similar to Adidas, it wasn't actually the brand themselves driving reach during Black Friday in any way. Rather, in this case, a distributor of Xbox named Prima Interactive ran an influencer campaign with multiple influencers over multiple posts that actually drove traffic to their Black Friday promotion on their website. What makes this particularly interesting is that Xbox actually benefited from basically free exposure. And more than that, presumably without even knowing, actually dominated the Black Friday 2022 in terms of reach and visibility as far as their logo is concerned. So as you can see in the metrics here, they actually achieved a reach of nearly 5 million during this period, compared to Adidas's 1.5 million. And while Prima Interactive is a seemingly legitimate retailer, I mean, and I'm saying that because I actually don't personally know them, but they're definitely legit. What this does do is bring to light a bit of a brand safety issue where other less legitimate sources can actually also gain major reach using your logo. And this kind of image recognition via social listening is actually an incredible, powerful brand watch feature. That's something all brands can and should actually incorporate into their reporting, or at the very least, just track and stay aware of. But what this actually made me think of while I was researching and looking into this battle between Xbox and Adidas, I mean, they didn't know they were battling, but they were, was how cool an Adidas and Xbox collaboration would be. And while I didn't really find any Adidas featuring in any of the Xbox games that I know, I did find shoes. Lo and behold, a quick Google search showed me that they've actually already been one step ahead of me, pardon the pun. And they've actually released these sneakers earlier this year, and they actually look really cool. I wouldn't mind grabbing up a pair of those. But jokes aside, let's shift over to sentiment a little bit during Black Friday. Year on year in this graph, you can see leading up to 2019, this is quite an interesting development, is that negative sentiment, hopefully you can see, was actually almost double positive sentiment for the first few years. However, from 2019 onward, we can actually see that positive and negative sentiment are almost equally matched. This lines up with something we're going to unpack a little bit more later in this webinar as well. And that is the rise of e-commerce and online shopping, kick-started by the COVID-19 pandemic and lockdown. People seem to be becoming less and less cynical over Black Friday in recent times, and are actually starting to see it as an opportunity to get some convenient online shopping done ahead of the festive season. But more on this later. So diving a little bit more into sentiment, here we have a consolidated, homogenized view of all Black Friday sentiment since 2016. This is not really to show any other reason other than just having a bit of fun to see what South Africans have said about Black Friday on Twitter over the years. So as you can see here in the positive example at the top, this guy bought himself a new Audi. Other people are calling Black Friday a scam. There's a few more mentions here. As we can see, this person is saying that Black Friday is actually stressing her out because she doesn't have any money. And South Africans actually, in this case, blue tick Black Friday, as in we're ignoring it. It's just interesting to sort of highlight and see the different opinions we still see around Black Friday year on year. But then what we did, diving deeper into sentiment, using Brandwatch's unique emotion breakdown, where we can actually see a deeper level of sentiment and see what the driving forces behind positive and negative mentions. Here we actually have a graph looking at anger behind Black Friday year on year. And we can actually see that anger is seemingly reducing year on year. And this is once again reaffirming that people are seemingly growing more accepting towards Black Friday. Whether it's a convenience, savings, e-commerce push, or a combination of some of these factors, South Africans themselves are actually not pushing back as much as they used to. Conversely, looking at the joy emotion year on year around Black Friday, there are two interesting call-outs here. And firstly, joy didn't really rise year on year as one might expect compared to anger reducing, while mention volume, as we showed in the first slide, actually stayed the same year on year. This kind of indicates that while South Africans are growing less angry about Black Friday, they're not particularly getting increased joy from it either. This is probably more closely linked to the rising cost of living, as we've said, and the fact that South Africans don't use Black Friday anymore to splurge on luxuries, but rather to save on essentials, which is something that people don't tend to brag about. And then the second call out here is the high spike of joy we see in 2019. This is the highest peak just before COVID-19 hit the world. And while there wasn't, and I really tried my best, no particular reason for no particular driving force behind the spike, what I did think and what I did find was it was actually quite a poetic, symbolic, and sobering indication of how badly we were all knocked down during COVID-19 right after that. And then we would be remiss not to mention Singles Day and Cyber Monday as well in the context of Black Friday. There's just a quick 2 slides about this. And firstly, on the left-hand side, what we've actually done is we've pulled out Cyber Monday and Singles Day conversation together. And interestingly enough, 2 call-outs here as well, especially around Cyber Monday, is firstly, in 2020, when it was the height of COVID, e-retail and Cyber Monday specials specifically actually took its lowest dive in recent history, which is quite an interesting interesting data point there. But as we can see right after that, as brands started adopting that sort of e-retail avenue, you can see those mentions spike higher than ever. Now, Singles Day is something that we don't really adopt in South Africa as much. And as you can see in the conversation graph over time here, it definitely doesn't feature as much as Black Friday or Cyber Monday in any shape or form. With that being said, though, we did find some brands who do leverage these tactical days, specifically Singles Day, as you can see in the Flying Fish example here. But then, of course, our e-commerce platforms like Takealot and One Day Only, of course, leverage Cyber Monday very, very heavily. And with that being said, I'm handing over to David to sort of look ahead at Black Friday.
Thank you, Sean. Now that we've dissected past Black Friday trends, let's look at what this means for future Black Fridays, or of course, specifically the one just around the corner. There are 2 types of people in this world. Ones that start buying Christmas decorations full of excitement in July, and ones that curse capitalism under their breath when they start seeing shops turn red, white, and green ahead of the Christmas season. That being said, the online Christmas conversation doesn't start visibly increasing until October, as we can see from this graph showing us online mentions of Christmas in South Africa in the span of 2022. I think it's interesting to note here that the Christmas conversation in South Africa generates well over 100,000 mentions in late December alone. And as you'll see in a moment, the Black Friday conversation doesn't quite hold up in terms of volume. Here's the Black Friday conversation in South Africa in November 2022, last year. Its peak generating just over 25,000 mentions. So really not much in comparison to Christmas's 100,000 mentions at its biggest peak. Now, losing a mention volume battle against Christmas is nothing to be embarrassed about, right? Christmas has the unbeatable Christian marketing machine behind it, while the origins of Black Friday are somewhat debated. ChatGPT dates the origin back to the 1960s as a reference to the chaotic shopping day after Thanksgiving. But anyways, back to the data. We can see that the conversation of Black Friday doesn't start until well into the month, reaching 5,000 mentions on the 24th and then spiking past 25,000 on the 25th. The conversation, of course, spiking again after the weekend for Cyber Monday and, as Sean just mentioned, the Singles Day event. The question we're trying to answer here is, how early do brands and companies start launching their Black Friday campaigns? And the answer, as we can see on the screen, at least for last year's Black Friday, is the 7th of November. We can see Woolworths was the first to release early Black Friday deals on the 7th of November. Vumatel started urging customers to prepare for Black Friday deals on the 15th of November. And Takealot launched a fully fledged campaign called Takealot Blue Dot Sales on the 21st, focusing on granting customers early access to Black Friday sales by downloading the app. I'll touch on early access initiatives a little bit more in a moment. And then, of course, as is to be expected on Black Friday itself, we see a hype erupt by posts from Facebook, F&B, Castle, Black Label, just to name a few of those big brands. Now, judging from this historical data, we would expect Black Friday campaigns to only start ramping up by mid-November this year, right? And if we look at this next slide, the data, at least so far, confirms this. So we're looking at mentions of Black Friday from June 26th to October 26th this current year. And you'll notice the highest peak on October the 11th. On October the 11th, spots a volume of just over 50 mentions. So nothing close to what we expect to see in November based off of the previous slides of the past year. Nevertheless, we do kind of see that trend line slowly starting to emerge. What's more, we caught Pick n Pay red-handed launching early Black Friday deals on the 12th of October. But besides that, brands have not yet unleashed the discount hounds this year. What we're seeing rather is a lot of mentions from individuals, right? You'll see on this next slide, this is the nature of mentions that we're seeing instead. Black Friday is being used as an arbitrary buzzword to promote deals and sales, like we can see on the 15th of June. Individuals are sharing Black Friday strategies, most of which include buying everyday household items to cut down on costs rather than splurge on luxuries. That's testament to the smart shoppers and the modest spending habits in Cyril's economy, as Sean briefly touched on earlier. And lastly, we're seeing a lot of our favorite South African online magazines share tips on how to tackle the big shopping day just ahead of the Black Friday month. Now, to circle back to the early access initiatives I mentioned earlier, the rise of e-commerce splintered the Black Friday shopping experience. It's now longer and has more purchasing entry points, being websites, apps, and in-store, said Harley Finkelstein, the president of the e-commerce platform Shopify. As an analyst, I don't believe anything anyone says unless it's backed by data. But as it turns out, Mr. Finkelstein is right. E-commerce, and specifically mobile e-commerce, have in fact taken center stage. The stats on this slide are relevant to that and should prove that, right? In fact, the stats on this slide are relevant to individuals that have mentioned Black Friday or affiliated keywords. And as we can see, they are more likely to be active online via their mobile devices than via desktop. What's more, this is even more true for South Africans in particular. As you can see, the dark bar of the graph of the metrics refers to global audiences, while the lighter bar refers to the South African audience, which means over 80% of South Africans that have mentioned Black Friday are more likely to shop from their phones. Sean has already shown you this graph of Black Friday mentions year over year. What we've done below, though, is to categorize online Black Friday mentions. In other words, or what that means is mentions pertaining to Black Friday in connection with online stores and or apps. There are two things I want to point out here. Firstly, I must address the massive peak in 2021 brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic and the race for e-commerce amongst brands. We saw spend towards e-commerce spike drastically in 2021 across the board, causing online stores to erupt. These numbers, of course, dropped again in 2022 as lockdown regulations fell. We got to go outside again, and the physical store experience came back into play. Despite this drop, however, we can still very clearly, even if modest, see an incline in online Black Friday mentions, especially from 2016 to 2022. And surely numbers in 2023 will follow suit. A large conversation driving volumes of online Black Friday specifically, and the mentions last year, were early access initiatives. Brands use the Black Friday hype to drive customers towards their apps, the bait being early access to Black Friday deals or further discounts and prizes. Here we can see some of those examples, right? Taking us back to the Take a Lot Blue Dot sale we mentioned earlier. Despite these initiatives, mentions of apps amongst consumers only made up 1% of the overall Black Friday conversation. But I have to say, we're not all too surprised by this, right? Downloading an app instead of visiting a website is a strong commitment to a brand. We're less likely to download an app if we don't see ourselves making more purchases from this brand in the future. I know that's true for me. And it's also the same reason, however, that we're seeing a rise in drive for app downloads, right? Because of this commitment it garners between brand and consumer. If you're a gym rat and enjoy your smoothies, you'll have noticed Virgin Active's initiative gifting members free smoothies for using the app consistently. If you prefer having groceries delivered and over going to the store, you'll have seen Pick and Pay's app revamp as a maneuver to stay in the grocery delivery game against Woolies and Checkers 6060. And come Black Friday, the one that's around the corner, we expect to see a lot more of such bait.
Thank you, David. And as I mentioned, this was a bit of a shorter webinar, but in conclusion, just to kind of recap what we've spoken about already so far, Black Friday mentions in South Africa are not slowing down, and net sentiment is actually on an upward trend. Due to the cost of living crisis, South Africans are not spending on luxuries, but they're rather spending on essential goods. As David just spoke about now, e-commerce has taken center stage with brands clearly pushing app downloads more and more. But brands do not seem to be leveraging Black Friday specials, rather utilizing competition mechanics to drive engagement, which does seem to be a bit of a missed opportunity, while the majority only start talking about Black Friday in the latter half of the month. So with that being said, though, it's clear that a large portion of the Black Friday game is played online. In other words, if you're looking for a bigger stake in the game, especially if you're in retail or FMCG, social media and e-commerce will be your best friend. Black Friday is definitely here to stay, and people are keeping their eyes on it. And with that being said, as I mentioned, if you guys are interested in learning more about Brandwatch or talking data analytics via Technologies, please scan this QR code. Please book a session with me and David so that we can discuss about sort of what data your organization needs. Secondly, please connect with us on LinkedIn as well. We love talking to our peers and colleagues and clients in the industry as well. With our industry being as small as it is, it's super useful and powerful to share ideas and thoughts and so on. So scan these codes to please connect with us on LinkedIn. And even if you have questions about this webinar, which we'll take in a second, but if you want to if you want to unpack it a little more with us, send us a DM on LinkedIn, and we'd absolutely love to talk to you. But with that being said, thank you for joining our webinar. It's not over yet, and we still have a bit of time to take some questions. So please feel free to share some comments in the chat, some questions in the chat, or even if you're brave enough, unmute yourself and let's talk about some of the things we covered today. Feel free to raise your hand also. No pressure. Don, I can see you've raised your hand.
I'll jump in. What have you guys seen has been the most successful mechanic for companies for Black Friday?
So personally, and I mean, this was David's topic, but I actually really loved that the Patagonia Black Friday example. It's almost like an anti-campaign, because while on face value you can almost see that, or you can almost argue that Patagonia is not leveraging Black Friday through resisting to discount their products and so on, but in essence they're actually leveraging Black Friday, because they're making people, I mean, they're still using the topic as a means to drive the campaign, and of course garnering a lot of interest from people, making them look at what they have to offer.
That's an interesting point, Sean. I just want to add to that, because you did have a slide showing us kind of the most successful posts around Black Friday. And I think what's noticeable there is Patagonia being so successful with their stance, because it's kind of arbitrary, right? Next to the mainstream, it kind of stands out amongst all of the posts that we're used to about here are your deals and so on and so forth. I think I was not at all surprised to see Pineapple in one of those top posts, right? Because they have that exact strategy of just being arbitrary, kind of beside the line, a little bit next to the mainstream, which kind of just widens your eyes a little bit more when you have a look at it. That's something I'm also definitely seeing is not just successful in the name of volume and reach, but also just engagement. I guess just because it's so kind of fun and outside of the norm.
Cool. Any other questions? Anyone, feel free, like I said, if you're a little nervous and you don't want to go on camera or on voice, feel free to drop it in the chat. and we'll be happy to address them. I'll just move back to this section as well. And as I mentioned, if you do want to learn more about Brandwatch or data analytics, please feel free to book a session with me and David, and we'll be happy to chat to you. I can see questions coming in the chat here. Aaron, do you think we'll see more brands leveraging influencers for Black Friday, or is it a stronger and cheaper for the brand to do it directly? That's a really great question, Aaron. As we saw with those logo insights, the Xbox or the brand that leveraged Black Friday and the Xbox promotions, Prima Interactive, they managed to get that reach purely from an influencer campaign. Now, with that being said, it's that age-old argument: is reach, worth less than mentions or engagement? That's up for debate. But in terms of visibility and using influencers, Xbox and Prima Interactive absolutely dominated the conversation last year. So I think there's definitely something in there. Don, what's an influencer? Oh gosh. David's an influencer. Maybe you can explain.
Influencers are people that drive engagement for brands. No, I just wanted to touch on what you said, Sean. I think that's a really great point. But also, I think we're in a space, and we touched on this in our last webinar, I believe. We're in a space where I think brands are learning a lot about influencer marketing, specifically how to generate content that is engaging for your average consumer, rather than just your shameless plugs by influencers driving a lot of reach and engagement. And so I think we are in an era for that to ramp up, and hopefully we do see that also working out more and more.
Cool. Jenna Feather, in your opinion, is it a missed opportunity not launching any deals on actual Black Friday, but having a deal run from start end of Black Friday week? Yes. I mean, what we've seen in our data is that many brands, not just in South Africa but across the world, seem to leverage the entirety of November for Black Friday, or at least a large part of it, and especially that sort of week on either end, including Cyber Monday. So what I do think is missing in South Africa, and I don't think I'm the only one who thinks this, is the actual specials on Black Friday, and I'm just talking from a consumer's perspective, is often not as big as you see elsewhere in the world. And as we also mentioned in this webinar, most of the big brands who do leverage Black Friday does it via competition and rather than a promotion or a special. So I do think, at least in our market, there is absolutely an opportunity for brands to leverage the true idea behind Black Friday, which is bigger discounts and those kinds of things, which hopefully all of us cash-strapped consumers will hopefully see in the next coming years. David, I don't know if you'd like to weigh in on that as well.
No, I agree. I'm just looking at the chat here, and Aaron made a really interesting point about Black Friday still being a very American concept, right? I couldn't agree more. Aaron also does mention here that we see Americans trampling over each other for a $50 TV, and that maybe we're more civilized. You've got a lot of faith in us, Aaron, but from that point of view, I think I'd agree.
Robin is saying Black Friday at least falls on payday weekend at least, which is that's a problem.
Sean,
yes, Cami.
Can you quickly scroll up to the graph that looked in the spikes of conversations from Black Friday? Just going off Jenna's question, it'd be interesting to see if there is that definite spike in conversation on Black Friday, whether it's like the 25th or whatever date it happened to be last year, or is the conversation, I think, one back. Yeah, so I think to that point, Jen, it kind of makes sense to have something to talk about on actual Black Friday, because that's when people are like chatting about it. But then I guess the other converse to that is the competition prior will potentially be less. So it feels like a dual-pronged approach. Have something to say prior to Black Friday, whether it is through that lead generation or signups or talking about early access. And then on the 25th, it feels like you do need to have something to say, because that's where the conversation's happening.
Absolutely. Thank you, Cami. I can see Makua raised their hand. Don't know if it's disappeared now. Makua, if you can hear us, I did see your hand being raised. If you have a question, please feel free to fire away.
I think they might have left the call.
That's possible.
Yeah.
I think with that, I can see people sort of falling off here, and perhaps we can wrap it up. As I mentioned, this webinar will be available for sort of on demand on LinkedIn in a few short hours, I believe. I don't know. But yes, you can always reference back to it. And again, feel free to reach out to myself and David, either via LinkedIn or using that QR code to book a meeting with us. And we'd love to talk to you about Brandwatch and data and insights and Black Friday more and more and more. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Cara. And we're looking forward to seeing everybody in the next webinar. Thank you.